Okay, well, we can see it. So sorry about this, Richard. Um, all right, so we'll get started. Apologies for all the technical issues. I sincerely apologize for that. Um, but let's get started. So I will give Richard's introduction. I am very excited that Richard's going to give us a lecture today. Richard is the founder of the Datalist Workshop and an adjunct professor here at the School of Public Architecture. For those who have not had Richard in class yet, Richard is a professor of Building Systems 1 and 2 and the Comprehensive Studio. In his teaching, which I find to be very critical, he aims to help students understand how a building really comes together. Through case study analysis and the examples explored in his lectures, he also tries to demonstrate and hopefully inspire how building systems such as site design and structure, MEP systems, lighting, materials, acoustics, egress, and circulations are all essential design drivers that should always inform our ideas and overall design process. Richard has taught at NYT Old Westbury campus and has been invited juror at several architecture schools in the New York City area. Richard received a Bachelor of Science degree in architecture from The Ohio State University and his Master's of Architecture at Syracuse University, where he was awarded several scholarships, teaching assistantships, and travel research grant for his graduate thesis, in addition to Hadrian's Villa, which was recognized with honors and the James A. Bryden Award for Outstanding Thesis. Before starting his practice, he worked for Gwathmey Siegel and Associates, Pape Partnership Architects, Peter Gluck and Partners, HLW, and the Rockwell Group. The projects he was involved with at those firms have been documented in several monographs and publications, ranging from high-end residences to museums and gallery buildings, corporate interiors, multi-use high-rises, and hospitality projects throughout the US, Middle East, and Asia. His own work includes projects in New York and Southeast Asia and has been featured in magazines, journals, and HGTV. Richard was a recipient of the Lloyd Warren Fellowship and the Paris Prize, which provided funding for travel and research to Egypt, India, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Greece. He was recently awarded an Innovation and Design Award from New York Cottages and Gardens magazine for an apartment renovation project in Manhattan. In 2021, along with a colleague practicing in Hanoi, Richard was invited to present their project for a bamboo educational campus at the World Congress of Architects in Brazil. Richard's lecture tonight will discuss these projects and more, as well as these ideas and inspirations behind them. And on a personal note, I always feel that every time I have a conversation with Richard, I learn a lot more. So I am very excited for his lecture and the fact that I think as well as a building systems instructor, sometimes we consider that to be kind of the most boring subject in architecture. But I think the way that Richard teaches it really focuses on the idea of harmony. All parts have to come together for a building to succeed. And all parts are just equally as important to design, because without all parts being harmonized, this design doesn't work. So thank you, Richard. And welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction and the personal note. Also, I want to thank Craig and Dean Money, and congratulations, David, to you and your wife for your new addition to your family. I also want to thank the administrative staff and the students who sort of work behind the scenes and put all of this together. And a special thank you to Umberto Gavino, all the way over in Rome, who helped put the lecture poster together with me. Another special thank you to my friends. They may not be on YouTube now, but my many friends, colleagues, and professors throughout my education and career who have guided, provoked, and challenged me and helped shape my thoughts, many of which the results you're going to see tonight. Of course, I want to thank my family, my parents, and my partner in life who have supported my education, indulged my desires to become an architect, to travel, experience the world, and who have provided the means, ability, and encouragement to explore and investigate my ideas. Disclaimer, some of the images I'm going to show tonight are not mine. I don't own the copyrights to them. So I just want to sort of get that out there. I'm just borrowing them to illustrate some of my ideas. And ideas are what I want to talk about tonight. Initially, I thought I would just show you some of my recent work and a couple of my favorite projects. Is that working up there? Okay, and maybe talk about some of the inspirational sources behind them. But as I began compiling the images, I realized those sources, the seeds of the idea behind those projects, could be traced back even further to concepts that were inspired by other places, other buildings, other projects that I'd either known about or seen or visited. Then diving deeper into my memory, even those sources revealed still more spaces and experiences that have long been on my mind and had certainly influenced my work and interests over the years, be it academic, investigative, or actually built. I wouldn't be able to just show my work, sorry. I wouldn't be able to just show my work and talk only about the projects themselves in an isolated, detached sort of way. Instead, I realized I should talk more about the ideas behind the projects, what generated those ideas and concepts, how were they formed and developed, how, if at all, does an idea, a spark of inspiration, become reality or otherwise get built. By default, then, the discussion would have to involve work by other architects and perhaps even things outside of architecture, painting and sculpture, of course, but film, literature, music, and dance as well. And so, in what might seem a rather random stream of conscious or exquisite corpse type of approach to talking about my work, I would ask you to bear with me as I try to uncover what lies behind it. Can I get rid of the little, can you see that up there? Just so it doesn't bother me, but.
There you
go. Oh, perfect. What interests me, what interests me more than talking about my my own work is exploring and looking back, trying to find out where ideas, concepts, and inspiration might come from, and by extension, what are the roots of any architect's work? What have other architects looked at? What did they see and experience? And how did those things inspire them and their ideas? How did those experiences transform their work? And what should we look at? What are we looking at? What have we seen or experienced that inspires us or might form the foundation of our own ideas? What grabs our attention? What strikes our eyes and makes us look closer and dream about building? What do we do to find inspiration, ideas, and concepts? How do we search for these things? Where do we search for them? Where can we go for inspiration? And how will we know what to do with it or what it might turn into? I would ask, what is it that informs our work? What forms our work? How do we learn from our experiences or something we've read, the things we've seen or what we've done? How do we translate all of that into something else, something new, something our own? I would say when the architect begins to draw or make a model, their mind begins to wander. The pencil, the blade of their knife, their thoughts all begin to stray. It is a venture we take down the many paths, the long, winding hallways of our memory and dreams. We, like Theseus, have entered a labyrinth looking for something. Our work, the sketch, the model, a building, however temporary or permanent, becomes the thread that we follow, which is our way out. It is a trace, a record of where we had been, and perhaps a guide for us to follow and remember at another time. Memory and dreams, as the surrealists would remind us, are foggy. The places, events, spaces, and experiences we remember and dream about are hazy, nonsensical, chaotic, out of sequence. Surely it is our mind trying to put things together to bring some kind of order and clarity to our experience. As architects, we unravel a roll of trace paper and lay it over our plans in sections. At first, the original below is blurred and distorted as we begin to draw. We persist and keep at it, adding more lines and layers. Our task, however, as we go on drawing and sketching, is to further define and clarify what lies below. Ours is a journey, a search for that clarity. Full disclosure, I don't consider myself a theorist or historian. My historical references, interpretations, and transformations may be inaccurate, questionable, or maybe altogether sometimes misplaced. Tonight, some of the projects I'll show you are rather old and perhaps dated. Please don't laugh at me. I know I'll be jumping back and forth in time, diving in and out of different cultures, leaping across oceans, running through very, very different landscapes. I'm afraid I've probably rolled 3 or 4 talks into one, and at times I may go too fast or bounce around a bit too much. Probably Betty Davis has the best advice. And so, where do ideas come from? What prompts us to make specific design decisions? How do we form those concepts for our projects? How do we generate ideas? I would propose that ideas are primarily generated through 3 different means. These are the springs, the seeds, if you will, from which our, or at least my own, ideas and concepts grow and develop. The first of these, I'd say, is precedent. I was an undergraduate student at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, during some exciting times for the program and architecture in Columbus. The new dean at the time, Rob Livesey, was bringing in younger faculty. The program was taking on a notably more theoretical focus, and big name architects at the time, like Michael Graves, Charlie Gwathmey, and Peter Eisenman, were giving lectures to talk about their work. It was Peter Eisenman's presentations, however, and his ideas for the competition to design a new visual arts center on campus that opened my eyes to a way of thinking about architecture and how a building might be conceived. Watching it get built after I had graduated further altered my understanding and appreciation of what it means to design and build something. Eisenman's scheme for the project, you can see the cursor, right? Eisenman's scheme for the project site acknowledges the street grid, the off campus. You could see over here, campus being in this area, obviously. His scheme acknowledges the difference between this grid and the campus grid, which is more locally aligned and anchored to High Street running along this axis here, and also borders the eastern edge of the campus. If one extends the street grid through the main eastern gate of campus at 15th Avenue right here, you'd cross the center line of Ohio Stadium, which I realized is celebrating 100 years of existence this year. So be it. But perhaps more significantly, this axis, 15th Avenue, running along here, historically marks the original intended route of the national road, what eventually became US Route 40, Route 40th parallel here. What became Route 40, the first highway, I believe, actually authorized by Congress in the late early 1800s, initially proposed to run from the East Coast to the Northwest Territories and beyond as a means of transporting people, goods, and commerce as the country expanded westward. This gridding helped federal, state, and local jurisdictions distribute land, mark territory, all while simultaneously determining the overall appearance and landscape of the country. Coincidentally, the axis of the oval also serves as a visual cue for pilots flying into the Columbus airport. Also notable, and buried beneath the chosen site for the center, were the foundations of the former campus gymnasium and armory, now since long demolished after a fire in the early 1950s. Eisenman would reconstitute this structure as an abstract reference in his design, evoking the presence of something long since absent as an architectural investigation of language, semiotics, and deconstructivist theory. You could love or hate this building, and to our minds now, perhaps these ideas may not seem so interesting or new, but at the time, for me, I had no idea that one could conceive and build a project on so many levels while exploring so many different concepts. Concepts such as excavating the earth while flying 20,000 feet above it, construction and assembly, geography, landscape, and the use of the ground plane, path, journey, circulation, history, memory, origins, and ruin. Designing a building, conceiving architecture through the lens of these ideas would always influence how I thought about making architecture. I would explore these themes myself a few years later when a professor suggested I propose a new entry sequence to Hadrian's Villa as my graduate thesis at project at Syracuse. Built by the Emperor Hadrian between 121 and 135 AD, the villa lies about 20 miles east of Rome. I had first visited the villa after finishing the Syracuse program in Florence, and I had known about the villa and was long aware of its influence on architects, planners, artists, and writers, thinkers throughout history. Over the centuries since being discovered, the villa has been mined for its wealth of architectural ideas on landscape, planning, architectural space, form, vaulting work, and its use of light. I knew there would be much to learn and understand by putting the villa in front of me for an entire academic year. During my thesis semester, I received a research grant allowing me to return to Rome for additional documentation on the villa, which proved very instrumental in learning even more about the villa. And during that trip, I was able to visit, study, and record several other Renaissance era villas located throughout the Roman Campagna as well. Elements I experienced and documented in these villas, the notion of path and journey, views and access, manipulation of the ground plane, as well as movement through, up, down, and around the landscape, the use of water, pergolas, terraces. All these ideas and elements would find their way into the thesis for sure. But it was largely the villa itself that would have the most significant impact on me. Landscape, memory, excavation, and ruin are, of course, major themes threading through the villa, but even a quick tour of it reveals an even greater exhaustive study of architectural spatial ideas, concepts, and contrasts. Ideas such as light versus dark, open versus closed, mass and void, contraction and expansion, straight versus curvilinear, center versus edge and border, movement versus rest, solid versus reflective, symmetry and axis versus the oblique and hinged. These and other factors would inspire the conceptual framework for the project as well. But always, of course, there was the life and myth of Hadrian, the man himself, especially revealed in his speculative autobiography by Marguerite Yourcenar. I would say also the literary epics of James Joyce and Homer, with their subtexts of journey, wandering, and return, juxtaposed with Hadrian's travels and the overall landscape of the Greek and Roman empires, they too would all factor into the thesis. All of these things, legend, mythology, history, and certainly the whole experience of the villa in itself, in its ruined state and in reconstructed views, the imagination of what it was, what it is, and what it could be, everything had to factor into the narrative, the conceptual and architectural structure of my project. And always present, of course, the themes of movement, path, and journey, massing, volume, the ruins of crumbled walls and shattered vaults, buried tunnels, outward views and vistas, inward focus, water pools, geography, and landscape. I would try to capture all of these ideas and concepts with my intervention. Then, some years later, I began what has become an ongoing project while working for some very good architects, but not always having the opportunity to implement the themes that interested me through the projects I was involved with. I thought of having my own ideal client, an author, a thinker, scientist, anyone for whom I could design a place where they might live, write, or experiment, and where I could explore these ideas and concepts for myself. Although this first project has been in progress for some years, and I'm still developing drawings, models, and watercolors for it, I chose to begin with Augustine, the 4th century saint, an avid reader, thinker, prolific writer, and orator, who some might argue could be considered the father of modern thought on many levels. St. Augustine, I think, would need a remote place, one that he would travel to with his guests, engaging in dialogue, conversation, debate along the way. The journey, path, and movement toward and up to his villa would have to be part of the experience, as portions of the villa, views of the sea, and a cascade of water falling from a terrace reflecting pond would punctuate that voyage. There would be spaces for reflection, a library for manuscripts, places to read and write. It would have living quarters, cells for his guests, fellow travelers, and other writers and thinkers. There would be a refectory open to above, a garden, of course, and water. Always there would be spaces, rooms, halls, and balconies for walking, dialogue, writing, reading, and contemplation. I think Augustine would have liked that. Architecturally, spatially, my interest was to study movement, experience, and light, mostly in section and plan through the process of carving and slicing of walls, floors, and roofs. All of that, of course, filtered through the lens of my takeaways from the Wexner Center and Hadrian's Villa. Of course, I'd have to note the influence and inspiration of Loretta Vinciarelli's watercolors as well as the theater and set designs of Adolf Appia from the early 20th century. My interest in the idea of the monastic life, one of study, contemplation, simplicity, and searching, has different origins. Certainly, visiting the Carthusian monastery in Galuzzo was motivational when I was in Florence, as was seeing La Tourette, which was itself inspired by Galuzzo. But perhaps my initial awareness, intrigue, and fascination with monastic plans and cathedral complexes began during my undergraduate years when I spent a summer at Oxford University. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for somehow finding the money to pay for that experience. We traveled to countless cathedrals, priories, and abbeys, saw numerous naves and side aisles, courtyard after courtyard. To me, that's what it was all about: the courtyard, the cloister, and the life of a monk, of course, reading, writing, contemplating, and studying. We know the monastery gave birth to the entire idea of the university as a center of learning and thought from which entire towns and cities would grow. So then, right after graduate school, when I learned that the program for the Paris Prize competition was to design a middle school on an open site in Florida, I knew my scheme would have to investigate the courtyard typology. I would then go on to explore that typology further in my entry for the second stage of the competition, which was to design an academy in the Flatiron District. I would win the prize that year and use the funds for a travel itinerary I proposed to Egypt, Turkey, India, and Greece, places where I hadn't yet been, but knew that others had gone and learned from and built in before me. Egypt, of course, is all about the light. Blinding, intense, white-hot light. But it's also about shade and shadow. Massive, heavy, solid stone walls and columns, vast, wide, and colossal. All of it as if whole buildings were excavated, carved, chiseled, and left standing on their own beside the Nile. As it was with their belief in life and death, the architecture of the Egyptians concerns the path and your experience along the way. It requires your participation, movement, and progression along a singular, symmetrical axis continuously, all the way through to the darkest, smallest chamber. On to Greece and Turkey. The Mycenaeans, the Minoans, Greeks, and early Romans, they too, of course, were concerned with burial rituals, symmetry, light, shade, and shadow. But here, it is the landscape, raw nature, the mountains and topography, the sheer force of the surroundings that's fixed in memory. I couldn't have grasped any of it without Vincent Scully's great treatise, The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods. The text was an invaluable guide in understanding how everything here could be understood through the experience and movement within and around the natural physical setting. It's all landscape, the path and journey through it, what you see and experience as you are walking. Circulation and movement, light, shade, mass, volume, all of it, but at a vast, more distant and encompassing scale that would include mountains, valleys, cliffs, and coastline. Of course, there's the early Christian and Islamic work in Istanbul and Cairo as well. It too is all about bulk, mass, weight, and buttressed walls. And of course, the courtyard, always the courtyard. But here also, the architecture is about the volume inside, bringing light within. And how does one do that? Through openings, slices, cuts, and carving. India. India for me was yet again all about the searing, bright white, intense sunlight, mass, volume, solids and voids. But here it is also an architecture of layers, screens, and veils. Courtyards, certainly, and water. Overhangs and setbacks, the hidden, the mysterious, and unknown. Le Corbusier's work in India has all of that, of course, and experiencing places like Villa Chaudhon, the mill owners building, his capital complex at Chandigarh, was as if I were walking through one of his purest paintings. And it's that experience which called to mind another small studio project we had at Syracuse, and that brings me to a second method or way that I found ideas are generated. A project that I believe originated at Cooper Union under John Haydock was to analyze a purist painting. The goal, at least as I understood it at the time, was to three-dimensionally extract the painting's shapes and forms in order to recreate the depth suggested within a two-dimensional painting. I collected the materials, foam core, cardboard, and began to begin stacking them. But at one time, the blade fell out of my knife, and as I bent over to pick it up, I looked through the side of my project for the first time, rather than only viewing it from above. I saw then for the first time the space within the painting, and could more easily imagine I were walking through it, and a building of Le Corbusier's, which at that point in my education, I hadn't yet done in reality. These are very, very old photographs of the model that I took, and I apologize for their haziness, but maybe you get the idea. I would recall this process of discovery, this act of making, again, while I was studying in Florence. The term urban fabric, the figure ground of the city plan, was always discussed by my professors who described cities as a thick mass with the streets and piazzas carved out. So I bought several blocks of clay, spread them over a large board, and then overlaid a print of the city plan onto it. I began cutting and gouging out the streets and piazzas of Florence. This is not my model. Of course, this is a bronze casting by real artists, but I think you get the idea. Doing this revealed a different grid to me outside of the city. One of my professors would direct me to some research that led me to find out that the Romans had actually laid out the Arno Valley relative to the surrounding mountain range, as opposed to the typical north, south, east, west grid that they would design their city, lay out their cities on. This opened my eyes to a new way of understanding and exploring Florence. The Arno flows from west to east here in this direction, And Florence, known for its silk and wool industries, required clean water, right, for the tinting and dyeing of the fabrics. The workers in these, so those areas, those industries were concentrated more in the in this area over here on the sort of southwest side of Florence. And so that's where the workers would end up living, relatively poor and impoverished. Hence, the Franciscan order of Catholicism centered in this area, which is where Santa Croce is in Florence, on this side of the city, Santa Croce. Not surprisingly, across town, where the more wealthy merchant class would congregate, on the other side, lies Santa Maria Novella, where the Dominicans, kind of the polar opposite of the Franciscans, more intellectuals, collected manuscripts, etc. They lived over here. That was an interesting discovery for me, and it just so happens that front door to front door, at least as far as I could tell, was aligned with that original Roman grid of the Arno Valley. Santa Maria Novella. If you're a traveler coming from the north, you come down this road here, which was again aligned with that sort of Arno Valley sort of grid. You're coming and then you get close to Florence. You would travel down there, and then right as the grid starts to sort of change, rotate, guess who built their palace right at the juncture of those two grids? Palazzo Medici, Michelotto's great palace for the Medici family. Key sort of location when you're coming into the city from the north, you realize who's in charge here. Walking further down the Cardo, you then would come across Piazza della Signoria, where the Palazzo Vecchio is located, the place, the seat of power in Florence, where the leaders of the guilds would meet, the decisions would be made, wars would be waged, and real power was wielded. And who was there to meet us? David, looking south towards Rome, reminding everyone, wealthy and laborer alike, and especially the popes of Rome, that Florence was a power to be reckoned with. This is the Porta Romana on its way to Rome. On to Rome. So this idea of carving, layering, paired with the urban experience, played a further role when a very dear friend of mine gathered several young architects to propose our own version of the Noli plan, not unlike several architects and planners had done in the late 1970s. I lucked out and got one of the middle plates, the Campo Marzio, and went straight to work. Of course, I would look at Piranesi's version of the Campo Marzio, a city where Lou Kahn Piranesi's version of Campo Marzio, a city where Lou Kahn might have been on steroids in a delirious fever had he been given the chance to design it. And then I would also look at Lanciani's plan of Rome from around the early 1920s, I believe, catching the many layers, representing the many layers of history in a color-coded plan of the city. I decided my plan would be a combination of all these. Real and imagined. Oh, let me go back, sorry. My plan would be a combination of all these. Real, imagined, existing, ruined. It would include buildings that were or that might have been, and of course, it would include buildings from around the Roman Empire as well. The treasury of Atreus, the palace at Knossos, the Acropolis, even bits and pieces of Hadrian's villa. And then perhaps, being a bit feverish myself, I thought back to the purest painting exercise, walking through Florence and Piranesi's many views of Rome, and of course his prison drawings. So I imagined what it might be like walking around a city like this that I had planned. The many layers, the structure, the foundations, buildings half assembled, getting taller, or perhaps falling down, in the middle of being demolished, decaying into ruin. I wasn't really sure just what I was drawing, but it was fun. This idea of excavating and meandering through layers of structure had a more tangible application for me when I was asked to design a microbrewery and olive branch facility on a lot north of Houston. I would begin, of course, with the model of the site, which again, the process of making proved to be what drove the design. Sorry about that. Something. The olive making, olive oil and production, brewing process factored into the design as well. But I would begin with the model of the site, which again, the process of making proved to be what drove the design. Carving and digging, excavating allowed us to bury the program and be sheltered from the harsh heat of the Texas sun. And of course, there would be other precedents to consider, of course, the landscape and character of an olive ranch, the vernacular language of agricultural buildings, light, the olive oil and brewing process, and the growing industry of the farm to table experience. I'll just go through a few slides showing some of the process drawings, site plans, and some quick perspectives that I had started to sketch out. The end result of the site plan. Quick sketches. Again, moving around the landscape and part of the was part of the whole concept. The entry-level plan, the lower level brew house plan, sections. Certainly, one process that threads everything together here is the process of drawing and the discovery that comes from looking, seeing, and trying to record. It is, of course, a necessary process if we are to ever convert ideas into something that can be built. This leads us certainly to the third method of how we generate ideas: practice. Another way of saying that might be necessity is the mother of invention. In practice, our clients bring their needs to the table. We must come up with solutions to satisfy their problems and needs, what they deem necessities. It is our job, of course, to provide for those needs and resolve their problems. We must generate ideas and concepts specific to the task at hand, though at times the solutions might be applicable elsewhere. I think the best way to illustrate this would be through some examples of some smaller projects that I've worked on over the last several years. A physician decides to rent an office for his practice in a long, narrow basement space, but he wants it to feel open, airy, and vibrant. So we planned the exam rooms on one side and the small cubicle offices, storage, kitchenette on the other side. We worked with, we covered the conduit and pipes with the drop ceiling that worked with the sight lines, added cove lighting, color on feature walls, recessed other walls, and then added a mural of the forest, covered it with curtains. One client bought an apartment with an awkward bathroom access through the bedroom and very little storage. You can see typical one-bedroom apartment here, but access to the bathroom was through the bedroom. There was very little storage in the apartment. She had lots of shoes, clothing, and luggage, and she wanted a fireplace. We proposed a sliding screen door to close off the bedroom from access to the bathroom, demolishing the bedroom wall, bedroom and living room wall that was here, and replacing it with a double-sided cabinet. As well as recessed lighting and giving her more storage in both the living and bedroom areas. Section through that double-sided cabinet, bedroom on the right and living room on the left. Detail of the two-sided cabinet. A growing family with an apartment that was in the 1890s built girls' school in Brooklyn. They bought the studio apartment next door and wanted to expand. They wanted more storage, larger rooms for their two children, and a bigger, more open feeling kitchen accessible to the living room and dining area. You could see the original kitchen that they had here in this small space. What we did was uncover the cast iron columns from the original structure and begin to carve out more rooms and spaces. They also wanted additional storage. There is a loft, sort of a floor over this area of the floor plan, with a sort of a 7-foot high ceiling above there. They wanted more storage. We weren't allowed to increase the floor area of the apartment by code, so we had to get a little creative with some things. This series of slides will sort of show you the space as we opened it up. The client also wanted to sort of somehow not be so boxy with our intervention. So she asked us to put some curves on things and I used that as an opportunity to become a little bit more sculptural with our intervention. And then finally, so what we did, another way we sort of extended their storage area was to add or extend the loft floor here in this section with shelving, basically a bookshelf with the wood slats on it, which allowed them to store much more things, books and whatnot in the shelving here, and opened up the loft floor area to the right in this section, as well as introduce some additional lighting to the space. Moving on to other parts of the world, over to Bangkok, a growing family bought a series of townhouses all next to each other, 4 siblings. You could see the large plan here. They bought all 4 together, one for each one and one for their mother. The problem was there was no storage, so we had to again get creative and figure out ways to put storage into the 3-story townhouse. The one that I'll show you was for the youngest sibling. He took over the first and second floor. He was single at the time, and this will show you what we did. Pardon the clubby music. Then a few years later, he got married. Sorry. Yeah. he got married and then took over the third floor of the townhouse. And then we worked on renovating that. The concern here was they wanted, he traveled a lot, she was in the airline industry, and so they needed separate areas to screen off and be to get dressed, and bathroom entry needed to be sort of sequestered off from I'm gonna go through that again, from each other, but they still wanted it to be open and airy, of course, and able to sort of function on that level. So we're in that part of the world, and now I'll show you. I'll end where I initially began, talking about some of the more recent projects. These projects I'm working on with a good friend, Tuan Nguyen, and his office, Keko Collective in Hanoi. He and his team are working on a master plan for an eco park northwest of Hanoi, and we were tasked with coming up with a bamboo education campus, some sort of precedent and things that we were looking at in traditional Vietnamese architecture and temple complexes, again with the courtyard, but the idea of openness and free-flowing kind of space. We of course started out with model building again, building the landscape and figuring out the sort of how we wanted to terrace a relatively already flat area and begin incorporating the courtyards. The building requirement, the program required a series, a large open sort of place where they could assemble bamboo structures and construction, as well as have separate smaller areas that they could have workshops to train local craftspeople in bamboo making skills and crafts. Just going to go through some of these process images of the model as it came together, and all along as the model was coming together, we were working on drawings and details and refining the program as we went along. The resultant plan and the section through the overall site. Some renderings that the team in Hanoi put together. Then our most recent project that we worked on last spring and into the early summer was a competition for a museum in Binh Dinh, a museum for the province. We went through the usual sort of site and urban analysis, precedent sort of studies, as well as showing you some of the artifacts that the museum has in their possession. Right now, they just got a small sort of a building, and they wanted to grow and make the building more play a bigger role in the city and in the region. Some massing studies that they had done over in Hanoi, some that we had done here. as well as development of plans, sections, ultimately some details, more massing. The project is geared, the concept is basically to weave the building in more with the city itself through the series of these curves, these layers, as well as opening up the building to the access and circulation through the city. Series of plans. I believe, yeah. First floor plan. You can see we were trying to sort of keep the engage the building more with the city, make it more part of the daily lives of the citizens, able to sort of walk up this ramp and get to the top of the building. We planned a rooftop cafe and restaurant. Some interior views, the main feature of which the large curved walls around which one of them we put a ramp where you sort of go through the sequence of the history of the province. And they put together a video that shows more of this, and So, so I would end by saying, I don't know if it was obvious or apparent, but the video showed a lot of things, and that last project shows a lot of things that I was touching upon, you know, in terms of where ideas come from and what generated that design. So, like I said, I was just going to talk about that particular project, tell you more about it, as well as the other project in Vietnam. But then that's when I realized there's so many ideas wrapped up in that, and that I think that's what our architecture always is. We've got all this stuff bottled up inside of us, and so to just come up and show a project and talk about, you know, the plan, the front door, and all that, I didn't think would be so meaningful to us as students of architecture. So I'm hoping that all of the lead up to that, you could sort of see where the design came from and maybe where some of the ideas had developed from. And that said, I will close. I don't know if there's questions or any kind of thoughts or comments. Uh, Oh, thanks, David.
I have a question whenever you're ready.
Okay, David.
Well, first, what a spectacular lecture. I have to say it reminded me of two extraordinary lectures I've heard in my life, one by Aldo Rossi and one by Sam Mockbee. And the fact that most architecture lectures, people describe the slides they show. In your case, you presented a body of work and the images were illustrative of the story you were telling instead. And it just was incredibly powerful, and the images in the work was just extraordinary to see and beautifully done. So my real deepest compliments to you for this and for the preparation it took to put all this together. I just think it was an extraordinary, and I'm so glad we recorded this.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. That means a lot. I do appreciate that. I wanted to I didn't want to just get up here and talk about a project. And I tell students this too, that, you know, I'm more interested a lot of times in hearing about the ideas behind their projects, not necessarily a student coming up and saying, here's my front door and here's my, you know, explain to us where the program is. I kind of want to know more about what inspired them and how they got to the design that they're presenting, as opposed to, you know, where the front door is, or you know, things of that sort of mundane sort. Although, yes, of course, we have to have them figure all that out.
Yeah, it was great, and just the work yourself, your own work, Richard. I think it's just an extraordinary example. It's so completely thoughtful in the way that you do it. And we didn't have enough time for you to really get into the materiality of your own work in comparison to the kind of historical examples you talk about. But maybe you could say something about how you approach materials, especially contemporary materials, in the work that you do in your practice.
So my approach to materials is really, it's a good question, David. It's sort of generated from my professional experience. I'd have to say, working for Gauthamy Siegel and Peter Gluck, and having to know not just how materials go together, but you know, being aware of their tactility, and the way they're sort of joined and put together. That has a lot to do with the way I approach something. My contractors always sort of complain about always having to reveal a joint in between materials, And that definitely comes from detailing work at both of those offices, as well as, you know, my heroes like Louis Kahn, where you know, the separation of the concrete and the wood. You know, there's some very real practical reasons why we do that. But there's also something, an acknowledgement of the difference of the materials. I know that well, that may not answer your question completely, but it is something about putting a building together and a detail, a room, a space. And again, it's what I try to get across in my to my students in my classes. You know, we don't think about that enough, about how something is really put together, built, constructed, has to defy gravity, keep out, you know, the elements, all of those things.
Great. Well, thank you for that.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody else? Oh, yes. Hi, Camille. Okay. Yes, and I'll repeat your question. So the question is how might we better prepare students to go into practice, you know, and have some either knowledge or understanding of the real world application, right? I'll have to get back with you on that. And I know we'll talk. What's that? No, it's an interesting question, and one that when I graduated from my 4-year degree and worked for some hack architects in Columbus, and there are a lot of them there. You know, it was eye-opening to me. And it wasn't until graduate school when I started sort of thinking about things a lot more sort of physically, and then luckily getting the internship at a big firm that was known for its detailing and obsessive sort of, you know, drawings. That's when it really started to sink in for me. I don't know how I don't know how we inject that into academia. I would say we should, we kind of owe it to the students. The problem I would say is there's just so much to learn anyway. And right, we all know that. We want you to sort of learn this, do that, read this, you know, etc. And I think it's, and again, that's something that I tried to get across in the talk was where do we get these ideas from? And how do we sort of, it all comes down to the process of making as well. And that's not something that we do in school enough, or at least not from what I've seen, is the idea of the process of making and what happens when you do that. Because I think, and maybe getting back to David's question is, you know, putting something together physically. If we can get more opportunities for students to actually build something, maybe not, you know, a physical space, but even assemble something at a small scale, that I think, again, something happens in that process, something through osmosis that never ever will happen by just doing it on the computer. And so I don't know pedagogically how you do that in studio projects or a series of studios. I think it's something that, again, I try to sort of get across, at least verbally in slides and in my lectures, to sort of get the students to at least acknowledge, if not appreciate, at least be aware of you know, the physicality of what we do as architects. Because again, a lot of times our heads, yours, not mine, are buried in the computer, and we're moving lines around, and we don't have any real world tangibility to that, I think, until you actually start building something or making something. Yeah. Well, yeah, and again, that's what I wanted to sort of get across was in my own education and sort of experience. I mean, my professor in Florence never told me to make a clay model of the city. I just did it because I had this urge to sort of do that. You know, they all talked about you know, the sort of figure ground, the sort of, you know, carving of the city and all that. And I'm like, I was also taking a class on Michelangelo at the time in Florence, and his sort of idea about, you know, he could see the sculpture in the stone and he just chipped away the excess, right? So I had this urge to sort of do that, make that clay model. And when I did that, you know, I realized like, oh, there's this other thing happening with the city plan. And I asked my professor, Maurice Cox, I don't know if you know him, but he was my professor at the time. He was a really, really great guy. And you know, he put me in touch with this, or he got me this book, you know, told me to look through about the research that was done. Those images tonight were from a more recent sort of analysis. But again, my point was, I never would have looked at the city and realized certain things. I'd been in Florence for like at least a few weeks, walked by all those buildings, but never thought about that. But again, the whole realization, the epiphany, if you will, happened when I just started to physically make something. And again, it's that process that I think should be more a part of our, you know, training, because I know for me, it was, you know, instrumental, eye-opening and all that. I don't know if that answers your question, but okay. I think, I mean, you know, I know we'll talk anyway. Yeah, we probably don't. Oh, okay. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, David. Good luck and congratulations again.
Thanks. You'll meet him soon enough. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Oh. Awesome. I hope the pizza's not cold.